The stagecoach rolled into Caldwell, Kansas on the 23rd of October, 1882, and nobody who witnessed its arrival would ever quite agree on what happened first. Whether it was the door swinging open, the single leather trunk hitting the dust, or the sound of a voice so unlike anything the town had ever heard that three men at the saloon set down their whiskey glasses simultaneously, as though commanded by some invisible conductor. Vernon Garrett was leaning against the post outside Briggs' General Store when she stepped down from the coach. He was 31 years old, broad in the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something honest by years of wind and sun, and the sort of hard labor that left a man too tired at night for pretending. He had a half-eaten biscuit in one hand and absolutely no intention of being interested in anything that afternoon. He was supposed to be picking up a sack of cornmeal and a new coil of rope and getting back to the ranch before dark, because two of his fence posts on the eastern pasture had gone soft with rot, and the cattle were not going to wait for him to find a better day. But then she stepped down, and the biscuit stayed where it was, halfway between his hand and his mouth, forgotten entirely. She was perhaps 26 or 27, dark-haired, with eyes the color of a late autumn sky that had not quite made up its mind between gray and blue. She wore a traveling dress that was practical but clearly tailored with a care that Caldwell had never seen, a deep burgundy wool with cream buttons at the wrist. She looked at the town, at its single main street, its false-fronted buildings, its water trough with the broken hinge, and her expression was not disdain exactly, but it was something close to it. It was the expression of a person who had not expected much and had, nonetheless, been surprised by the degree to which their low expectations had been met. She said something to the stagecoach driver as he handed down her trunk, and every syllable she spoke was liquid and foreign and utterly incomprehensible to every soul within earshot. Sheriff Dale Hutchins, who happened to be crossing the street at that moment, stopped dead. He was a practical man. He had dealt with outlaws and drought in a saloon fire in the summer of 1879. He had not dealt with this. He looked at Vernon. Vernon looked at him. The driver climbed back up to his bench without meeting anyone's eye. "She's speaking Mexican?" Hutchins asked, to no one in particular. "No," said old Emmett Pryor, who had materialized from somewhere near the barber shop and was now squinting at the woman with frank curiosity. "That ain't Spanish either. I heard Spanish once in San Antonio. That's something else." The woman turned and addressed the assembled gawkers directly. Whatever she said was composed and deliberate and clearly, from her tone, a question. Nobody answered. Nobody could. She looked around at the row of blank faces, drew a slow breath, and then reached into a small bag she carried at her wrist. She produced a folded piece of paper and held it out toward the nearest person, who happened to be Vernon. He took it because it seemed rude not to. He unfolded it and read the name printed inside in careful English lettering, Beaumont Ranch, property of Marcus Beaumont, Caldwell, Kansas, and beneath that, written in a different hand and crossed out twice, a note that said simply, "Marcus passed, March 1882, land held in trust." Vernon looked up at her. She was watching him with an expectation that was patient but not entirely without urgency. "You have business with the Beaumont property," he said slowly, enunciating each word carefully as though volume and clarity might bridge the gap. She blinked. She did not understand him. But she seemed to understand the direction of his gaze toward the paper, and she nodded once, firmly. Vernon looked at Hutchins. Hutchins looked at the woman. The woman looked at the paper, then back at Vernon, and said something in French that sounded, in its tone at least, like a polite but firm statement of intent. "Lord," said Hutchins quietly. "Somebody fetch Eliza Crabtree. She reads foreign books." "Eliza Crabtree reads French romance novels," Emmett said with the specific disapproval of a man who considered this a moral failing. "That doesn't mean she speaks the language." "It's better than none of us," Hutchins said. But Eliza Crabtree, when fetched, turned out to speak approximately 40 words of French, none of them particularly useful for establishing the legal status of a land inheritance. She could say good morning, good evening, I love you, and the names of perhaps 6 flowers. The woman listened to Eliza's halting attempts with extraordinary grace, smiled at each effort, and then finally, with a gentleness that somehow made the failure worse, shook her head. Vernon had not moved from the spot. He did not know why. He had his cornmeal to collect, his fence posts to mend. He was a practical man of practical habits, and standing on a boardwalk staring at a French woman who had arrived in Caldwell on what appeared to be a mission of inheritance was not on any list he had ever made for himself. And yet there he was. The woman's eyes moved back to him specifically, which he found strange, since he had done nothing more useful than anyone else. But there was something in his face, perhaps, that she had decided to trust. Or perhaps it was simply that he was still holding her paper. Beaumont, he said, pointing to the name on the paper and then gesturing vaguely to the south, where the old Beaumont property sat some 6 miles outside of town. She leaned forward very slightly. He could see her concentrating. Beaumont, he said again. Beaumont, she repeated, with a French rounding of the vowel that made the word sound entirely different and somehow richer than it had any right to be. He pointed south again. She followed his gesture, looked at the horizon, and then turned back and said something that he understood, despite not understanding a single word of it, to be a question about whether he could take her there. This was how Vernon Garrett, cattleman, owner of 47 acres and a herd of 68 longhorns, a man who had that very afternoon been planning to fix fence posts, found himself loading a French woman's leather trunk into his wagon and driving her south along the Kansas plain as the afternoon light turned golden, and the dry grass moved in the wind like something breathing. They did not speak. There was no point, but the silence was not uncomfortable in the way Vernon would have expected. She sat beside him on the wagon bench and watched the land with the focused attention of someone trying to memorize it. Every rise and dip of the prairie, every hawk circling overhead, every distant stand of cottonwood along the creek bed, she took it all in with those gray-blue eyes and something in her face that was hard to name. Not quite wonder, something older than wonder, something more like reckoning. He found himself watching her face instead of the road and had to correct himself twice. Her name, he finally gathered from one of several exchanges in which they passed the paper back and forth and pointed at various things, was Gertrude Thatcher. Or rather, that was the name written on the inside of the paper in the upper left corner in her own small, precise handwriting. She pointed to it and then to herself, and he said it aloud, giving it the hard English sound that felt slightly wrong on his tongue for a woman who looked as she did. She shook her head gently. She said it herself in French, and it sounded entirely different, softer. The first syllable stretched like something being savored, and she looked at him expectantly. Gertrude, he tried again, attempting something closer to what she had said. She almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was the frontier of one. She turned back to the road. He told her his name by pointing to his own chest and saying it clearly. Vernon Garrett. She repeated it immediately, perfectly, without hesitation, and he felt something entirely inexplicable happen somewhere in the region of his sternum. The Beaumont property was in a worse state than Vernon had remembered. He had ridden past it a few times since Marcus Beaumont had died in March from a fever that the town doctor had not managed to get ahead of, but he had not had reason to stop. The main house was a solid structure, timber-framed, with a good stone fireplace and a covered porch, but months of vacancy had taken a toll. One shutter was hanging crooked. The well needed its bucket replaced. Weeds had come up through the kitchen garden with the cheerful determination of things that nobody is going to argue with them. Gertrude stood in the yard and looked at the house for a long time. Vernon waited by the wagon. He could not read the look on her face, but he watched it move through several things, something that might have been grief, something that might have been resolve, something that might have been simple exhaustion from what had clearly been a very long journey. Then she rolled back the cuffs of her burgundy sleeves and walked toward the front door with the air of someone who had decided. The door was unlocked. Caldwell did not see much reason to lock the doors of its dead. She went in, and after a moment, uncertain whether he should follow or simply unload her trunk and leave, Vernon carried the trunk to the porch and set it down. He stood there for a moment, hat in his hands, looking at the open door. "Miss Thatcher," he called. She appeared in the doorway. She had found a broom somewhere. He had no idea where. Houses had a way of hiding brooms in the same place they always were, and she was holding it with purpose. She looked at him steadily, and then she said something quiet and deliberate, and he did not know what it meant, but the look that accompanied it was unmistakably gratitude. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He drove home in the long blue dusk and thought about gray-blue eyes and a woman who had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, with a trunk and a piece of paper and no English at all, and who had still, somehow, managed to say everything that needed to be said. He fixed 2 of the 4 fence posts before dark and could not entirely account for where his mind was while he worked. He went back the next morning. He told himself he was going because someone needed to show her where the nearest well that worked reliably was, and because the Beaumont Properties winter stores were certainly empty, and because it was the decent thing to do. He loaded his wagon with a sack of flour, some salt pork, dried beans, and a jar of preserves that his neighbor Martha Stokes had pressed on him the previous autumn, and that he had never opened because he did not have a particular feeling about preserves either way. She was already up when he arrived, which he had half expected. The crooked shutter had been straightened. The kitchen garden's weeds were in a pile near the fence. She was on the porch with a cup of something hot, and when she saw his wagon coming, she put down the cup and came to the yard gate with an expression that was carefully neutral, as if she had not yet decided whether she was pleased or concerned. He held up the sack of flour by way of explanation. She looked at it. She looked at him. And then she said something that included the French word for thank you, which he did not yet know, but which sounded in a way that needed no translation. This became a pattern. He came each morning, not always with supplies. Once he came because the latch on her woodshed was broken and the wind the night before had been fierce. Once because the water in the well was tasting of iron, and he knew a way to clear it with clean gravel brought from the creek. Once because his cattle had wandered through a gap in the shared fence line, and 2 of them had ended up in what he now thought of as her pasture, and he needed to retrieve them, which was entirely true and only slightly an excuse. She was always busy, always working. He learned quickly that she was not a woman who waited for things to come to her. She attacked the house with the focused energy of someone reclaiming something, and it responded. The floors were scrubbed, the rugs beaten, the broken window latch replaced with a piece of wire that was temporary but effective. She had found a vegetable cellar beneath the house that still held some things from the previous year: dried onions, a crock of lard, some winter squash that was still firm. She inventoried it all with the methodical precision of someone who had done this before, who had made things work before, and who was not going to be defeated by distance or cold or the total absence of a shared language. He found himself looking forward to those morning visits with an intensity that he examined carefully and honestly and could not dismiss. He was not a man who confused himself easily. He knew what loneliness felt like because he had lived with it for 7 years since his wife, Clara, had died in childbirth in the winter of 1875, taking with her the child and leaving him in a house that had never quite recovered its feeling of being a home. He had managed. He had worked. He had kept going because there was always another thing to do, and doing things was how he kept himself from going under. But there was a difference between keeping going and actually feeling alive, and standing in Gertrude Thatcher's yard watching her carry firewood with a kind of determined grace was doing something to the second category. He also knew that he could not talk to her. And this was the thing that kept him honest with himself, kept him from romanticizing what was happening. Because what was happening, really, A French woman had arrived on his neighboring property, and he helped her out because she was alone and winter was coming and it was the right thing to do. That was all. He did not know anything about her. He did not know where she had come from, or how she had known Marcus Beaumont, or why she had come all this way across an ocean and a continent to stand in the Kansas wind and beat rugs. He did not know if she was brave or frightened or both. He did not know if she missed France, if she had family there, if she had left something behind, or if she had run from something. She was speaking constantly, which only made it worse. Not at him, exactly, she knew he could not follow it, but she spoke the way some people hum, as though the silence without sound was something she could not quite tolerate. She would narrate what she was doing, apparently, or comment on things she saw, or sometimes seem to be working something out in the quiet dialogue of someone thinking aloud. And occasionally she would glance at him mid-sentence, catch herself, and make a gesture of apology that somehow communicated both, "I know you cannot understand me, and I am going to keep talking anyway." He began to listen not for meaning but for music, the rhythms of it, the way certain words appeared again and again, the shape of her sentences. And then, at the end of October, barely 8 days after she had arrived, he did something that surprised even himself. He rode into town to the one-room schoolhouse where Miss Pauline Graves taught the children of Caldwell, and he knocked on the door and asked, in the most straightforward way he knew, whether she had a French dictionary. Pauline Graves was 24 years old and had studied at a teacher's college in Missouri, which made her the most formally educated person in Caldwell and the person most likely to have a French dictionary. She looked at Vernon with an expression of pure delight that she immediately composed into something more professional. "A French dictionary," she repeated. "Yes," he said. "For what purpose?" He considered the question more than it seemed to deserve. "My neighbor," he said finally. "She arrived from France. She has the old Beaumont property. She doesn't speak English. And you want to learn French." "I want to be able to say more than just her name and point at things," he said, with a bluntness that made Pauline Graves smile genuinely for the first time in the conversation. She had, as it turned out, not a French dictionary but something close, a French-English grammar and phrase book called Practical French for the Educated Traveler, published in 1871, which she had acquired in Missouri and carried to Kansas for reasons she had never fully justified to herself. She lent it to him with the slightly awed expression of a person who has been holding something for years without knowing why, and has just discovered the answer. He read it that night by the light of his oil lamp until midnight, and the next morning he drove to Gertrude Thatcher's house with the book in his coat pocket. She was in the yard splitting wood, which she was doing competently if not entirely with the technique that was easiest on the back. He took the axe from her with a gesture that was more instinct than strategy, and he split the remaining wood in the time it would have taken her to do half, and then he set the axe against the woodpile and pulled out the book. He opened it to the first page of vocabulary. He pointed at her. "Vous," he said, in an accent that was almost certainly appalling but was at least the right word. She stared at him. He pointed at himself. "Gee." Her mouth opened slightly. She looked at the book in his hand and then at his face, and he could see something happening in her expression, something that moved through surprise and into something warmer and more complicated, something she did not seem to have words for even in the language she had words for everything in. "Gee," she repeated, pointing at herself. He nodded. "Vous," pointing at him, then shook his head. "Gee," pointing at her. "Vous," pointing at him. She understood. "Oui," she said, and then caught herself and pointed at the book. He turned to the word and found it. "Yes." He repeated it. She shook her head and corrected his pronunciation with a gentleness that somehow did not diminish the correction, and he tried again. This was how they began. It was not fast. It was not graceful. But it was real in a way that Vernon Garrett was not sure anything had felt real in quite some time. He went home that evening with 6 words of French, which was 6 more than he had started the day with, and he read the grammar book at his table until the lamp oil ran low, and he fell asleep with his head on the open page. November arrived with the particular seriousness that Kansas Novembers have, a cold that does not apologize for itself, that comes in from the north with the no-nonsense commitment of something that knows its job and intends to do it. The wind cut across the plains with a directness that made the shortcomings of inadequately chinked walls very obvious, and one of the shortcomings of the Beaumont house was that it had several such walls. Vernon spent 2 days in early November working on the chinking with a mixture of clay and dried grass, talking to himself in French while he worked, which was the method he had developed for studying narrating his own actions in whatever French words he had, stringing them together into grammatically dubious but earnest sentences, and then correcting himself when Gertrude appeared to see what he was doing. She was amused by this, he could tell. She tried not to show it, or rather she showed it in a controlled way, the slight pull at the corner of her mouth, the deliberate steadiness of her expression that told him she was working very hard not to laugh outright. He decided he did not mind. If she was laughing, even almost laughing, even fighting it, then she was not cold and alone and far from home. He would take the almost laughter as a fair exchange. She was, he learned through the slow accumulation of understood words and interpreted gestures, Marcus Beaumont's niece. Marcus had been born in France, had come to America in the 1840s, had eventually made his way west, and had built his ranch over 30 years of difficult, determined work. He had never married. He had corresponded with his sister-in-law Gertrude's mother for all those decades, long letters that had taken months to arrive, but arrive they had, and through them Gertrude had grown up with a picture of Kansas in her mind as vivid and strange as any fairy tale. When Marcus died in March without a will, the land had been held by the county until next of kin could be located. It had taken months of letters between Caldwell's county clerk and various French authorities, during which time Gertrude had been making arrangements to cross the Atlantic, because she was not going to lose the only piece of her uncle's long life that remained. This was what Vernon assembled, piece by piece, over the weeks of November from a combination of translated words, carefully drawn pictures that Gertrude sometimes made on the back of brown paper to illustrate a point, and the particular expressiveness of her face when she was explaining something that mattered to her. He learned the French words for family slowly, like learning the names of rooms in an unfamiliar house. Famille, mère, uncle. He learned mort before he learned most other words, because the death of Marcus was the anchor of the story, and she needed to say it and he needed to understand it. He learned the word for letters, which was close enough to its English shadow to be almost easy. He learned the word for far loin, and the way she said it told him something about what it meant to her to be that word from everything she knew. What she did not know, and what he was careful not to burden her with, was that Caldwell's county record on the Beaumont property was not entirely clean. Marcus had had a small mortgage taken out in his final year with the Caldwell Savings Association, which had not been paid because there was no one to pay it. The amount was not enormous by the standards of what the land was worth, but it was enough to create a lien that could cause complications if the new owner did not have ready cash, which Gertrude Thatcher, who had spent her savings on the passage across the Atlantic in the train west, almost certainly did not. Vernon knew about this because Dale Hutchins had mentioned it in passing at the general store one morning, in the casual way that small towns discuss other people's business. He had gone home and sat with it for a while, turning it over the way you turn a stone to see what lives under it. Then he had gone to see Harlan Briggs, who ran the Savings Association in addition to the general store, and had quietly paid the outstanding balance. He had not told Gertrude. He was not sure, even as he did it, why he was not telling her, except that he did not want her to feel beholden to him, and because if she knew, the gratitude would change something between them that he preferred to keep unchanged. He told himself this was neighborly. He told himself a lot of things that were true but not quite complete. November deepened. The days shortened. The prairie went the color of old straw, and the sky became the color of pewter, and the wind found every crack in every wall of every structure for miles around. The town of Caldwell hunkered down with the stoic practicality of a place that has done this before and will do it again. Gertrude Thatcher did not hunker. She adapted, which was different. She learned the geography of her new life, which firewood burned longest, which corner of the house stayed warmest, which neighbor to buy eggs from on what days. She introduced herself to Martha Stokes, who lived 2 miles north, by arriving at her door with a small jar of what turned out to be a French fruit preserve that Gertrude had somehow produced from a cache of dried figs she had brought in her trunk. Martha Stokes, who was a woman of large heart and comprehensive hospitality, had pulled her inside and kept her for the afternoon. Martha reported to Vernon the next day, with the slightly breathless enthusiasm of someone who has just met something remarkable, that Miss Thatcher was extraordinary. That she had somehow, with 12 English words and an absolute absence of self-consciousness, communicated more warmth and character than most people managed in an hour of fluent conversation. That she had admired Martha's quilts with an expressiveness so genuine it was almost embarrassing. That she had sat at the kitchen table and eaten biscuits with the focused pleasure of someone who knew the value of a good meal, and had said something in French that Martha felt certain meant that they were the best biscuits she had ever eaten. "She's learning English," Martha told Vernon. "Did you know that? She has one of your books, I think. She showed me." She'd written English words on a piece of paper next to the French, and she was studying it while she waited for the biscuits to come out. Vernon had not known she was doing this, and the information did something to him that he could not quite catalog. He had been teaching himself French. She had been teaching herself English. They were both, independently, reaching across the same silence from opposite sides. He sat with this on the ride home and felt something wide and warm settling over him that he was, at this point, very close to admitting was love. He was not sure what to do with that admission. He was not a man who moved quickly in matters of the heart. He had been married to Clara for 4 years, from the ages of 20 to 24, and she had been the only woman he had ever loved, and when she died he had closed that part of himself with the kind of thoroughness that only grief can produce. He had not been interested. He had not been looking. He had told himself this so many times, and for so long that it had stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like a fact of his character. But facts, it turned out, could be revised. The last Saturday of November, he arrived at her house to find her in genuine difficulty. She had been trying to move the cast iron stove in the kitchen, which she had apparently decided needed to be closer to the interior wall to radiate heat better, and had gotten it 6 inches from where it started before the physics of a 400-pound stove had made their opinion known, and now it was sitting at a crooked angle with one of its legs up on a piece of split wood she had wedged there as leverage. And the whole situation had a precarious quality that made Vernon's chest tighten. She was standing back from it, hands on her hips, looking at it with the expression of a general who has encountered an unexpected defensive position and is not yet ready to admit defeat. When she heard his wagon she turned, and for a moment her expression shifted through something complicated. Was it relief? Was it embarrassment? Before settling back into composure, he looked at the stove. He looked at her. He said in his best assembled French, "Je vous aide, I will help you." The grammar was probably wrong. The pronunciation was almost certainly imperfect, but her face when he said it did something he had not seen it do before. Her composure slipped, just briefly, just for a moment, and what was underneath it was not weakness but something more like tenderness, unguarded and real, there and then gone, replaced by a nod and a movement toward the other end of the stove. They moved it together, which was a matter of significant effort even with 2 people, requiring 2 separate tries and a brief conference conducted entirely in pointing and facial expressions to agree on the approach. When it finally settled into its new position, flush against the interior wall, level, stable, Gertrude pressed both hands flat to the warm iron surface, as though confirming for herself that it was real. and then turned and said something short and complete and heartfelt. Vernon looked up "thank you" in his phrase book later that evening because he had recognized the word she used, merci, but he wanted to know all the ways she might say it, wanted to know the architecture of gratitude in her language so he could recognize it in all its forms. Merci. Je vous remercie. Merci beaucoup. Avec reconnaissance. He practiced them all quietly to the wall of his bedroom while the November wind moved outside. December arrived, and the snow arrived with it, not in flurries but in the committed way that Kansas snow sometimes came, a full-scale reconfiguration of the world's surface that happened overnight and left everything muffled and white and utterly transformed. Vernon woke up on the 3rd of December to 6 inches of snow, and a silence so complete it had a sound of its own. His first thought, before coffee, before fire, was about whether Gertrude had enough firewood. He got there to find her firewood supply was adequate, but her water situation was not. The well had frozen at the top, which he knew how to deal with, and she had been carrying snow inside and melting it on the stove, which was a solution but an inefficient one. He broke the ice, lowered a fresh bucket, and showed her how to cover the well opening with a piece of burlap weighted with stones to slow the freezing. She watched carefully. She repeated back his actions and his words both, because she had started doing this, taking each English word he used and saying it back, turning it over, filing it somewhere in the organized library of her mind. She was learning faster than he was, which he recognized and admired without feeling diminished by it. English had more footholds in the surrounding world than French did in this particular square mile of Kansas, and her need was more immediate. And yet he kept going. He had, by December, worked his way through the phrase book twice, and acquired from Pauline Graves a copy of a French reader designed for children, which Pauline had ordered from a St. Louis bookseller at his request, paying 3 weeks advance on the delivery, that contained short stories in simple French with vocabulary notes in the margins. He read these at night. He stumbled through them slowly, learning words for weather and seasons, and the names of trees and animals, and he found in the simple children's stories a kind of France. He could imagine markets and rivers and stone buildings and people eating bread in doorways. And he began to understand, in the way that language always eventually teaches you the interior of a life, why Gertrude spoke the way she did, with that rhythmic confidence, that quality of someone who expects the world to be interesting. He began to write things down, notes in the margins of the phrase book, words she had said that he wanted to understand, questions he wanted to be able to ask. He kept a small notebook in his coat pocket and added to it daily. On the 15th of December, he managed his longest French sentence to date. She had come to his property the first time she had done so, to return the spool of thread he had lent her for a repair, which she could have left on the porch but had instead brought herself, and he had opened the door and she had been standing there in the cold, and he had said, startling himself slightly, "Entrez, s'il vous plaît, il fait froid. Come in, please. It is cold." She came in. She looked around his front room, which was clean but sparse, a man's room, functional with good woodwork and not much else, and she made a small sound of appreciation for the stone fireplace, which was his one real domestic pride. They sat at his table and he made coffee, which was the one thing he made reliably well, and he produced a plate of the plain butter cookies that Martha Stokes had sent with him the previous week, and he set out 2 cups with the deliberateness of someone who has thought about this and does not want to show that they have thought about it. And they talked. Or rather, they talked in the way that they had developed over the past month and a half, a conversation assembled from both languages simultaneously, each reaching into the other's vocabulary when their own failed, filling gaps with gesture and expression and the occasional drawing. And it was slow and imprecise, and occasionally resulted in long pauses where one or both of them searched for a word, but it was genuine. It was a real conversation, and over the course of it, Vernon learned several things he had not known. He learned that she had been a schoolteacher in Lyon, that she had taught young children, ages 6 to 10, and that she had loved it with the particular love that people have for work that uses all of themselves. He learned that she had a younger sister named Colette who was still in France and who had thought Gertrude was making a serious mistake in coming to Kansas, and that the letters between them had been fierce and affectionate in the way that only sisters manage. He learned that she had studied English in school, which was why she was picking it up with such speed now. There was a foundation there, dormant, waiting to be stirred back into use, and she learned things about him. She had, by now, enough English words to ask simple questions if she assembled them carefully, about his ranch, about his cattle. She asked about the land itself, why he had chosen it or whether it had chosen him. He told her, in a mixture of both languages and a directness that surprised him, because it was the kind of thing he usually kept private, that he had come to Kansas from Tennessee at the age of 22, because he needed somewhere to become himself without the weight of other people's ideas about who he was. He had meant to stay a season and stayed 11 years. He said that Caldwell was not beautiful in the way that some places were beautiful, but it was honest. It showed you what it was and it left you to decide what to make of it, and he had come to love that about it. She listened to this with full attention. And then she said, in French, something that he understood perhaps 70% of, which was enough, that she thought she understood what he meant. That France was beautiful but heavy with itself, full of what things had always been, and that there was something almost alarming about a place like this. All this horizontal sky with nothing between you and the horizon, something that felt like freedom and exposure at the same moment, and she was still deciding how she felt about it. "But you stayed," he said in English, because the sentence would not assemble in French. She understood him. "Mais oui," she said softly. "Yes, but yes." They finished the coffee and the cookies. The fire burned low and he added another log. Outside the snow was still and white, and the afternoon had gone the color of blue wool. Neither of them moved to leave for a long time. It was Martha Stokes who finally said what the rest of Caldwell had been saying to itself in increasingly pointed terms. She arrived at Vernon's property on a Tuesday morning in the third week of December, ostensibly to bring him a jar of apple butter. But she sat down at his table and fixed him with the expression of a woman who has a purpose and is going to pursue it through whatever social niceties are required. "Vernon," she said, "everyone in town is watching you drive out to that French woman's property every single morning like the sunrise." "She's my neighbor," he said, which was true. "You paid off Marcus Beaumont's mortgage," she said. He looked at her. "How did you know that?" "Harlan Briggs has a wife," Martha said simply, as if this explained everything, which it did. He was quiet for a moment. "She would have lost the property." "Yes," said Martha, and he looked at the jar of apple butter on his table. "I'm not having this conversation," he said. "That's fine," said Martha cheerfully. "You don't have to have it with me. Have it with yourself if you prefer." "But Vernon, I have watched you for 7 years since Clara passed, and I have never once seen you come back from anywhere with that look on your face that you come back from her place with. Not once. And I am telling you this because I love you like a brother, and also because it is December and she is alone, and it will be a very long winter if neither of you has the sense to say what is happening between the two of you." He opened his mouth. "And do not tell me nothing is happening," she said pleasantly, "because that is a lie and we both know it." He closed his mouth. He picked up the apple butter. He set it down. He was, at his core, an honest man, and Martha Stokes had been his friend since before Clara died, and there was no point in lying to a friend. "I don't know how to tell her," he said finally. "I don't have the words." Martha looked at him with great patience and no surprise. "Vernon, you have been learning French for 6 weeks. I know about 12 words for farming and 4 words for weather and 6 words for kitchen objects," he said. "I cannot conduct a courtship in kitchen objects." Martha pressed her lips together very tightly, in the specific way of someone suppressing something that is threatening to escape. "You have until spring to find the words," she said, "but do not wait until spring to find them." He thought about this for the rest of the day. He thought about it while he mended a saddle. He thought about it while he watered the cattle. He thought about it while he sat at his table that evening with the phrase book and the children's reader and the small notebook full of words he had been accumulating like a man gathering stones to build something without being entirely sure what he was building. And then he read for 2 hours, more carefully than he had ever read anything, looking for the words he needed. Not kitchen words, not farming words, not weather, the other words. They were harder to find. The phrase book, designed for practical travelers, was mostly restaurants and hotels and directions. The children's reader was full of stories about forests and animals. But he was patient and he was methodical, and by midnight he had assembled with some confidence the following: Je vous admire beaucoup. I admire you greatly. Vous êtes courageuse et belle. You are brave and beautiful, and most importantly, the one he had looked for first. Je vous aime. I love you. He did not say these things the next day, or the day after. He held them in himself the way you hold a good hand of cards, not from weakness, but because the moment had to be right, and because saying these things to a woman who deserved to understand them fully required more than 12 words and a page of rehearsal. December turned toward Christmas. The town of Caldwell decorated its main street with pine boughs and red ribbon, and someone put a wreath on the door of the church, and the saloon put out a sign offering Christmas whiskey at reduced prices, which was its version of seasonal goodwill. There was a Christmas Eve service at the church that most of the town attended, bundled in wool coats and scarves, steaming lightly in the warm interior of the small building. Vernon drove Gertrude. He had asked in his best French, and she had accepted with a composure that he was learning to read as genuine pleasure carefully managed. She wore a dark green wool coat he had not seen before. She had made it, he realized, from fabric she must have ordered, and she sat in the pew beside him and listened to the hymns with an expression of concentrated attention. She did not know the words, in English or in any version she had encountered before, but when the congregation sang, "O Holy Night," she recognized it. He saw it happen, the slight widening of her eyes, the small intake of breath, and she began, very quietly, to sing the French words she knew, Cantique de Nile, and her voice was low and clear and true. And Vernon Garrett sat completely still beside her and felt something happening to him that he was done pretending was anything other than what it was. After the service, in the cold and clear night outside, the congregation milling about and exchanging seasonal well-wishes, Dale Hutchins shook Gertrude's hand with great formality and said, "Merry Christmas," in a tone of someone delivering important diplomatic news, which made her eyes dance with the laughter she kept so well contained. Eliza Crabtree said Joyeux Nile in her imperfect pronunciation, and Gertrude responded with warmth and patience. Martha Stokes embraced her as if they had been friends for years. Vernon stood at the edge of this and watched his town absorbing her, awkwardly and warmly and imperfectly, which was how Caldwell absorbed everything. On Christmas Day he arrived at her door at noon with a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside it were 2 things. The first was a bolt of blue fabric, the exact color of her eyes when they were more blue than gray, from Briggs' store. The second was a French-English dictionary bound in green leather that Pauline Graves had ordered for him weeks ago and that had arrived just the week before, complete and thick and smelling of fresh ink. He had written in the front of it in his careful hand, "Poor Gertrude Thatcher," avec admiration et espoir, for Gertrude Thatcher, with admiration and hope. She unwrapped it slowly. She read the inscription. She read it again. And then she looked up at him, and her eyes were very bright, and she said something in French that he understood completely, not because he knew the words, but because some things do not require words. He had brought a gift of his own cooking, as well a poor attempt at a cake that had not risen entirely correctly but was genuinely sweet, and they ate it at her table and argued about the French word for flour versus the word for dust, because he had mixed them up, and she laughed. Properly laughed, not the almost laugh he had been living on for 2 months, but a real laugh, clear and unguarded and warm, and it was the best sound he had heard since he could not remember when. January arrived with the full weight of a Kansas winter, which did not apologize for its ambitions. The temperature dropped low enough that the creek froze solid for the first time in 3 years, and Vernon's cattle were demanding constant attention, supplemental feed, broken ice in the water troughs, checking that none of the younger animals were in distress from the cold. He was busy from first light to well after dark most days, but he still came. Every day, even if only briefly, even on the hardest days when the cold made everything twice as slow, and his hands hurt, and the last thing he had energy for was driving 6 miles in the dark. He came because the alternative was not coming, and he had tried that exactly once, a day in early January when the weather was genuinely dangerous, and he had stayed with his cattle all day, and the feeling of not having seen her that day was so specific and so unwelcome that he did not repeat the experiment. She was learning English at a rate that astonished him. By January, she could hold a simple conversation with most people in town without too much difficulty. Her accent was strong and beautiful and entirely her own, and she made no apparent effort to diminish it, which he appreciated. She was learning English because it was practical, because she lived here now, because she could not conduct the business of her life in a language only she spoke. But she was not abandoning French. She would not. And he was still studying, still adding to the notebook, still reading the children's stories, which had gotten more complex as Pauline Graves had found him more advanced materials. He had written to a bookshop in Kansas City for a French grammar designed for adults, and it had arrived in January and was considerably more demanding than the phrase book, but he worked through it with the same steady persistence he applied to everything. He was getting better. He could feel it, in the way that you feel the difference in your body when something that was hard is becoming easier. The words were beginning to live in his mind with their own weight and texture, not just as translations of English things but as French things, with French rhythms, French sounds. In mid-January, there was an incident with his cattle that took up 3 full days. 15 head had gotten through a section of fence during a night of high wind and had wandered south into the open prairie, and the tracking and retrieval of them in snow was exhausting and cold, and required the help of 2 neighboring ranchers, including an older man named Sam Prout who came from a claim 2 miles east. Gertrude appeared on the second day with a pot of soup and the calm, organized competence of someone who understood without needing explanation what was needed: hot food, immediately, for men who had been working in the cold all morning. She set it up in Vernon's kitchen and served it without ceremony, and Sam Prout, who had known Vernon for 8 years and had a sentimental streak entirely concealed beneath his weathered exterior, ate 2 bowls of the soup and told Vernon afterward in a low voice, entirely serious, "You'd be a fool not to." The cattle were all recovered. The fence was rebuilt, this time with better posts. Vernon sat in his kitchen the night it was all done, too tired to move but not yet ready to sleep, and he took out the dictionary, the green leather one he had given Gertrude, because she had given it back to him 2 weeks later with a note written in French and English both, pressed into the front, that said the dictionary should be shared between them, and he read the inscription he had written, with admiration and hope. He was not a man who waited for certainty before he acted. He had built a ranch from nothing on pure intention and hard work. He had made decisions in a storm that turned out to be the right ones and decisions in clear weather that turned out wrong, and he had learned that the condition of certainty was not always available, and that waiting for it could cost you more than the risk. He knew what he felt. He had known it for weeks. What he did not know, could not know, was what she felt. February came in with a brief warming that everyone knew better than to trust, a few days of relative mildness that made the snow drip from eaves and the mud reappear, and then a return to cold that was, if anything, sharper for the false hope. But those few mild days had a quality of light that was different from January's light, something in it that was already barely beginning to think about spring. On one of those mild days, a Sunday afternoon when the light was long and gold and the air had a breathable quality it had lost for weeks, Vernon saddled his horse and rode to Gertrude's property because he needed to not be in his house anymore. She was in the yard. She had a piece of paper and a pencil, and she was sitting on the porch step. The air was warm enough, barely, and drawing. He tied his horse at the post and came around to the yard, and she looked up, and the smile she gave him was so immediate and unguarded that it took him a step back, almost literally. He sat on the step beside her, which she made room for without comment. She tilted the paper toward him. She had drawn the view from her porch, the long, flat horizon, the low scrub, the distant line of cottonwood along the creek. It was good. She had an eye for it, for the particular horizontal quality of this landscape, the immensity of the sky. "C'est beau," he said. "It is beautiful." She looked at him sideways. "The drawing or the view?" He turned to face her. The English surprised him. Her English was good now, genuinely conversational, though it had the careful architecture of someone who builds sentences with intention. He found he was looking at her face from very close, closer than he usually allowed himself. "Both," he said, and then, because he had been carrying it for weeks and the February light was the color of something honest, "Gertrude." She put down the pencil. She faced him. He had rehearsed this in French and had found that the rehearsal was no help at all now that the moment was here. He had the words. He had built them carefully, checked them, practiced them until they were smooth. But they were in his throat and he could not quite release them because for the first time in a very long time Vernon Garrett was frightened. Not of rejection exactly. Of the thing after the fear, whatever it was. "Je vous ai," he started and stopped. Swallowed, tried again. "Je vous admire plus que je ne puis le dire." "I admire you more than I can say." She was very still. And here his French entirely left him, and he said it in English, and it was not polished or careful or even entirely grammatical, but it was entirely true. "And I think I have been in love with you since the day you stepped off that coach, and I don't know if you feel anything of the kind, and I don't need you to tell me today or any day soon, but I had to say it, because I am not built for silence on things that matter." She looked at him for a long moment. Her gray-blue eyes moved over his face with the thoroughness she applied to everything. And then she said, in careful English, each word placed like something she had considered, "I have been learning English very fast, Vernon. Think you know why?" He was very still. She picked up the pencil. She drew a small heart on the corner of the page unself-consciously, simply, and then looked up at him with an expression that was not the controlled composure he had come to know, but something behind it, something that had been waiting there. "I came here because of my uncle's land," she said. "I stayed because," she paused, choosing words, "because something here is mine, not just the land." She stopped, corrected herself. "Not only the land." He reached out and took her hand, which was ink-stained from the drawing, and she let him, and they sat on the porch step in the February light with the long Kansas horizon ahead of them and something between them that was no longer a silence but a beginning. He did not kiss her that day, not because he was reluctant, but because it was not the day for it. It was the day for saying what was real, and they had done that, and it was enough. There was time. There was all of winter still, and then spring, and then all the time after spring, which was more than anyone needed. What he did do was stay. They sat on the step until the light changed and the air turned cold again, and then she made coffee and he brought in more firewood, and they sat at her table with the green dictionary between them, and she taught him 5 words in French he had not known, and he taught her 3 phrases in English that were useful on a ranch, and it was the best evening he could remember in years. March arrived, and with it the serious business of spring preparations on both properties. Gertrude's vegetable garden needed to be turned and planned. Vernon's cattle needed to be assessed for winter losses, the pastures inspected, the fencing gone over with fresh eyes. There was an enormous amount of practical work to be done, and both of them understood this, because they were both practical people, and being in love did not mean the work went away. But the work was different now. He brought his plans for the spring pasture rotation to her table and spread them out, and she asked questions in English with French words where she needed them. And she had ideas about the rotation pattern, about using the creek access more efficiently. That were good ideas, rooted in something she had learned from her uncle's old letters, which Marcus had filled with 30 years of hard-won knowledge about this specific land. She had the letters. She had kept them all, brought them across the ocean in a bundle tied with ribbon, and they were a kind of guidebook to the Beaumont property written by the man who had known it best. He wrote about the North Pasture, she told Vernon one evening, reading from one of the older letters, a March letter from 1868 in Marcus's careful French. He says in early spring the North Pasture floods, only for a week or two, but the grass that grows afterward is better than the rest. He says the cattle know this, he says they wait for it. Vernon thought about this. He was right, I've noticed that. I thought it was just the water table. He paused. He knew this land. He loved this land, Gertrude said. She folded the letter with care as she always did. As I am beginning to. He looked at her across the table. She met his eyes. Neither of them needed to say anything else. In March, Vernon Garrett built Gertrude a proper shelf for Marcus's letters. He built it from good pine, measured carefully, with a narrow edge railing so nothing could fall off, and he fitted it to the wall beside the fireplace where the letters would be warm and safe, and where she could reach them easily. He mounted it on a Sunday morning while she went to town for supplies, and when she came back and found it, she stood in front of it for a long moment with her hand pressed to the wood. Then she turned around and crossed the room and kissed him. Not tentatively, not with any of the careful management she usually brought to her emotions. Just directly, with her hands on either side of his face, which was the most straightforward thing she had ever done and also the most eloquent. He kissed her back with equal directness, and the moment had the quality of something that had been inevitable for months and was only now arriving, which made it both a surprise and a homecoming simultaneously. April arrived with the smell of wet earth and the first green coming up through the dead winter grass, thin and tentative at first, then broadening and deepening into the particular rich green of a Kansas spring, and the cattle moved out into the south pasture with the enthusiasm of things that have been patient for a long time. The county recorder came through Caldwell in April, doing his annual rounds, and Vernon went with Gertrude to ensure that the Beaumont property's deed was correctly transferred to her name. There were no complications. The mortgage lien had been cleared. Property was hers, clean and complete, and the recorder shook her hand and noted in his ledger, Gertrude Thatcher, sole proprietor, 42 acres, Beaumont claim. She stood outside the recorder's office with the official paper in her hands and looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked at Vernon. It is real, she said. Always was, he said. Non, she said, gentle but firm. It was possible, now it is real. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her bag. There is a difference. He thought about that distinction for the rest of the day. May brought warmth and growth, and a kind of expansiveness that the winter had made it hard to imagine. Gertrude's kitchen garden was planted with a combination of American vegetables and the French varieties she had managed to find seeds for through a merchant in Kansas City. There were climbing beans alongside things Vernon had never seen, and she described them in French with the pleasure of someone reintroducing themselves to old friends. She was fully conversational in English now. The accent remained and would always remain, but she spoke it confidently and well, with a precision that came from someone who had worked hard for every word and therefore chose them carefully. She still spoke French at home, to herself, in her letters to Colette, in the small daily rituals of thought. And Vernon now spoke it too, not perfectly, not without gaps, but genuinely. He could follow her when she spoke fast. He could read Marcus's old letters with only occasional help. He had worked through the adult grammar book and started on a collection of French stories from the school in Kansas City that were written for actual adults, and he read them at his table in the evenings with the steady absorption of a man who has found something he did not expect to need, but now cannot imagine being without. He had not simply learned French because she needed him to. He had learned it because it was hers, and because he wanted to know everything that was hers, and because language was not just communication. It was the interior of a mind, the architecture of a way of seeing, and he wanted to know how she saw. On a warm evening in May, they were sitting on her porch watching the light change, and she said something in French that he had never heard her say before, and he caught it this time, all of it, without the gaps. "This is the hour in France we call El Heure Bleu," she said. The blue hour, when the light is between day and night, and it is the color of the sky before it decides to be dark. He looked at the sky. It was exactly that blue in a way that was deeper than daytime blue, richer, indefinite. "We have that here too," he said. "I just didn't have a name for it." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The blue hour held them there, on the porch of her house in the Kansas spring, while the last light moved across the plains and the first stars appeared, and it was one of the simplest and most complete moments of his life. He proposed in June, on the bank of the creek that ran between their properties. He had thought about how to do it for weeks. He had considered several approaches and rejected them all. He finally decided that the only approach that was honest was the direct one, because he was a direct man and she was a direct woman, and they had spent too much time navigating the difficulty of language to want to navigate the unnecessary difficulty of ceremony. He said it in both languages, one after the other, because both languages were theirs now. "Gertrude, je t'aime. Voulez-vous m'épouser?" He paused. "Will you marry me?" She was standing at the edge of the creek with her boots in the water. It was a warm June day, and she had removed them because the creek was cold and she liked cold water, which was a thing he knew about her now, one of the 100 particular things he had gathered and kept. And she turned and looked at him with those gray-blue eyes and said in English, "I thought you would never ask." He laughed. He had not laughed like that in years. "Is that a yes?" "Oui," she said. And then, "Yes, Vernon, yes." They were married in July in the Caldwell church by the town's minister, who accommodated the bilingual nature of the occasion by reading the vows first in English, and then, haltingly, in a French that Gertrude had coached him through the previous week with enormous patience. The church was full. Caldwell, which was not a large town, turned out almost entirely, because this was the kind of story that a small town recognizes as special and shows up for. Martha Stokes cried throughout the entire ceremony and was unembarrassed about it. Pauline Graves sat in the second row with the expression of someone who lent someone a phrase book and is watching what grew from it. Dale Hutchins stood in the back with his hat in his hands and nodded approvingly at the vows as though formally recognizing a negotiated treaty. Emmett Pryor, who had once said with disapproval that Eliza Crabtree read French romance novels, sat in the fourth row with his wife and did not say anything at all, which for Emmett was a form of approval. Gertrude wore the blue fabric. She had made the dress herself over the spring months, and it was the precise blue-gray of her eyes, and she wore it with her dark hair pinned up and a spray of wildflowers she had picked that morning from the creek bank. She looked like something the Kansas prairie had grown itself, like she had always been there and was only now being properly introduced. Vernon wore his good coat and a new shirt, and had had his hair cut by the barber the morning of, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle with the expression of a man who is doing everything he can to maintain his composure, and is not entirely succeeding. The vows, in both languages, were said and answered. The ring, which Vernon had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita, a simple gold band with a small inset of deep blue stone, was placed on her finger. The minister pronounced them married. Outside in the July sun, the whole town celebrated in the way that Western towns celebrate, which was with food and noise and a general cheerful disorder. Martha Stokes had organized a supper in the churchyard. Sam Prout played a fiddle with more enthusiasm than technical precision. Two of the younger cowboys from the east side of town attempted to dance and succeeded at least in being entertaining. Gertrude danced with Vernon in the churchyard, under the Kansas summer sky, to the imperfect fiddle, and he was not a natural dancer, and she was somewhat better but equally willing to forgive imperfection, and they moved in the space between the tables with the comfortable ease of two people who have already spent a winter learning the most important things about each other. She said something in his ear, in French, which he now caught entirely. "I did not think I would find this here." "What did you think you would find?" "Land," she said simply. "My uncle's land. I did not come looking for anything else. And," she pulled back enough to look at him, "and I found it anyway." She touched his face with the same gesture she had used when she kissed him in March, both hands, direct, deliberate. Tout cela, all of this. The summer was good. The ranch work was the work of two properties now being managed with a shared understanding, not merged, because Gertrude's 42 acres remained hers in her own name, a point she had made gently but clearly, and which Vernon respected without reservation, but coordinated, each supporting the other in the way that adjacent pieces of land and adjacent lives can when the people involved are sensible and committed. Gertrude hired a hand by September, a young man named Thomas Price, who was 17, and came from a homesteading family on the north side of Caldwell that had suffered a bad harvest and needed to place their eldest boy somewhere he could earn his keep. He was a good worker, quiet and willing, and Gertrude taught him through the fall with the steady, patient method of the schoolteacher she had been, and he was loyal to her property, and to her with the particular devotion of a young person who has been treated with dignity by an employer when they expected to be treated as a tool. Fall came again, the first anniversary of her arrival. A year from the October day when the stagecoach had rolled into Caldwell, and everything had, for both of them, quietly rearranged itself. Vernon was aware of the date. He had been aware of it for weeks. On the morning of the 23rd of October, 1883, he got up at dawn and rode to what had been the Beaumont property but was now simply Gertrude's, and he found her already up, as she always was, in the yard with her coffee, watching the morning light come across the prairie in that thin golden way that fall light did. He tied his horse and came to stand beside her. She handed him the second cup she had brought without him needing to ask. "1 year," he said. "Un-en," she agreed. He looked at the horizon. The grass had gone gold and rust with the season. The sky was the deep October blue that would not last much longer. The cottonwoods along the creek were turning yellow, each tree a small concentrated fire. "You could have gone to any town between New York and California," he said. "I came here," she said. "You came here speaking nothing that anyone could follow." She laughed that real, warm, unguarded laugh that had first made itself known on Christmas Day and that he now heard regularly and never tired of. "And you," she said, "spent all winter learning every word I knew." "I did not learn every word you knew," he said, with the humility of accuracy. "Your vocabulary is considerably larger than mine." "You learned enough," she said. She leaned against him, the way she did now, easily and without ceremony. "You learned the ones that mattered." He put his arm around her. They stood there in the October morning, in the year 1883, in the middle of the Kansas plains, which were enormous and honest and entirely indifferent to the small human dramas that played out across their surface, except that the light was very beautiful on this particular morning, and the air was very clear, and neither of them felt any need to be anywhere else. "There is something I want to tell you," she said, after a while. He waited. She turned to look at him. There was a color in her face that was not the cold. There was something in her eyes that was specific and particular and warm. "We will need a larger house," she said, "by spring." He was still for exactly 1 moment, and then he understood, and the understanding was immediate and complete and went through him like the kind of weather that changes everything after it passes. "Gertrude," he said. "We," she said, simply, watching his face with a happiness that was contained and certain and ready. He kissed her there in the yard in the October morning, properly and at length, and she let him, and when they separated she was smiling with her whole face. No composure, no management, just the full, unguarded expression of someone who is completely and straightforwardly happy. He built the addition that winter. He started planning in November and broke ground, or rather, broke through the frost with significant effort in December. And by February the framing was up, and by March it was sided and roofed, and by April, when the Kansas spring was making its tentative green return, the addition to the original Beaumont house was complete. 2 new rooms, one of which was a larger kitchen with better windows, and one of which was the room that would be needed. They had, over the winter, a great deal to discuss. She wrote to Colette. Colette wrote back in a long letter full of exclamation points and questions, and a final paragraph of unambiguous joy that made Gertrude read it twice, and then hand it to Vernon so he could read it himself, which he did slowly, only needing to look up 2 words. Martha Stokes, when told, embraced Gertrude for so long, and with such evident feeling that Gertrude eventually patted her on the back in the manner of someone managing a situation with affection. Pauline Graves brought a beautiful quilt she had made herself, blue and cream, with a pattern she called Missouri Star. Dale Hutchins said congratulations in his formal diplomatic way and looked, privately, deeply satisfied. Sam Prout said nothing, but brought a crib he had made from good walnut, which had been sitting in his barn waiting for the right purpose for longer than he'd like to admit. The baby arrived in early June of 1884, on a warm morning when the prairie was entirely green, and the cottonwoods were in full leaf, and the world seemed in reasonable shape overall. It was a boy, healthy and loud and equipped with strong opinions about his situation, which he communicated at considerable volume throughout the whole process, and then more or less continuously after. They named him Marcel, after her uncle. It had been her suggestion, offered tentatively, watching Vernon's face, and he had said immediately yes, of course yes, as if there had never been a question. Marcel Garrett. The name sat on the land like something that belonged there. Marcel proved to be a person of remarkable appetite and tremendous lung capacity, who slept in concentrated bursts and observed the world between them with focused attention, as though taking inventory. He had Vernon's coloring, the brown hair, the eyes that were going to settle into something between green and brown, but the particular set of his expression, the way he looked at everything with serious interest and no intention of pretending otherwise, was something Gertrude recognized as coming from a place she had inherited too. She nursed him and sang to him in French. Vernon rocked him and talked to him in the mixture of both languages that was now simply how their house spoke. Thomas Price held him once, carefully, and with an expression of absolute terror that eventually softened into something more like awe, and declared that he was very small and very loud and seemed, despite these facts, to be all right. The summer passed in the warm, busy way that summers pass when there is a new person in the house who has strong views about everything. The cattle were fat on good grass. Gertrude's kitchen garden was productive in a way that drew genuine comment from the neighboring homesteaders, owing partly to the French varieties she had introduced, which apparently got on very well with Kansas soil when given the chance. She had by now a small trade in seeds that she shared with neighbors, and she had begun teaching Thomas Price to read, which he accepted with the particular combination of embarrassment and gratitude that marks someone who has wanted something for years and was afraid to say so. Vernon, for his part, continued to read in French. He had moved well past the children's stories now, and was working through one of the novels Eliza Crabtree had lent him, a French novel, a proper one, and it was difficult and required the dictionary regularly. But it was worth the effort, because language learned through stories takes a different kind of root than language learned through phrase books. Gertrude, coming into the front room one evening and finding him deep in the novel with his reading glasses on and his lips moving slightly, stood in the doorway and watched him with an expression she had never needed to hide and never tried to. He looked up and caught her there. "C'est quoi?" she asked. "What is it?" He showed her the cover. She made a small sound of recognition, and came and sat beside him and began to tell him about the author, about the story, about why she had read it years ago in Lyon, and they talked about it in both languages simultaneously, as naturally as breathing. Marcel, in his cradle across the room, slept through this with the thoroughness of someone who had decided the world would still be there when he woke up. In the fall of 1884, Gertrude received a letter that had traveled a very long way. It was from the regional administrator of Lyon, officially responding to a letter she had written 6 months earlier regarding the inheritance documents on the Beaumont property. The letter confirmed that there were no further French legal complications. The estate had been properly transferred, all international considerations resolved. It was, in the formal bureaucratic language of an official letter from Lyon, France, to Caldwell, Kansas, a finality. The last thread cut clean. She read it at the kitchen table and then folded it and put it in the drawer with the official deed, which was where she kept the things that were settled and needed to be kept safe but not thought about every day. "Done?" Vernon asked. "Done," she said. She looked around the kitchen, the good stove in its proper position against the interior wall, the new shelves Vernon had built, the window she had asked for that let the morning light in, Marcel's small chair beside the table where he would sit in another year or so when he was ready for it, the rows of preserved vegetables and fruits from the summer's garden, the dictionary on the shelf beside Marcus's letters. "Done," she said again, and the word was complete, not empty, not unresolved, done in the way that things are done when they are right. Colette came to visit in the spring of 1885. She arrived on the stagecoach from Wichita, having crossed the Atlantic and the American East by train, and she was everything her letters had suggested. Younger than Gertrude by 4 years, bright-eyed and loud and entirely delighted by absolutely everything she saw, including the vast empty sky, including the false-fronted buildings of Caldwell, including Vernon, whom she assessed with the frank and comprehensive judgment of a younger sister, and then declared in French to be serious and good and far better than she had expected from such a desolate location. Vernon, who understood this, was charitable about it. "Merci," he said dryly. Colette stared at him. She looked at Gertrude. She looked back at Vernon. "You speak French?" "Un peu," he said. "A little," and then added with genuine honesty, "a lot more than a little." Colette stayed for 3 weeks, during which time she fell briefly and dramatically in love with the Kansas sky, taught Marcel his first French nursery rhyme, cried twice at the shelf of Marcus's letters, and left with a jar of Gertrude's fig preserves and a packet of the French bean seeds and a promise to return. The evening after Colette's coach left, Caldwell quieter again, Marcel asleep, Vernon and Gertrude sat on the porch in the May evening with the smell of new grass coming off the prairie. "She loved it," Gertrude said. "More than she expected. People do," he said. "You did," she said. She glanced at him. "Did you expect to when you came from Tennessee?" He thought about this in the way he always thought about things that deserved consideration. "No, I expected to find a place to work. I didn't expect it to become mine." And now, he looked out at the long horizon, the same view he had been looking at for 11 years, which never tired. "Now it is mine completely, in every way it can be." She reached over and took his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she held it in both of hers, and they sat there as the light moved toward evening and the first fireflies appeared above the grass, which was something Gertrude had discovered in her first summer and had never stopped finding marvelous, the way the Kansas night arrived with its own small lights, as if even the darkness here made an effort. "Je suis heureux," she said quietly. "I am happy." "Moi aussi," he said. "Me too." And they were. Not in the provisional, cautious way of people who know happiness to be fragile and hold it carefully to avoid breaking it, but in the solid, open way of people who have built something that can bear weight, who have worked for it, through language and distance and winter and patience, and the particular difficulty of two people learning not just each other but each other's worlds, and who know, with the certainty of experience, that what they have is real and lasting and entirely theirs. Marcel woke and announced this fact from inside the house, and Gertrude rose with the ease of someone who has done this 10,000 times, and Vernon followed her in from the porch. And the house received them both, warm and lit, full of the books and the letters and the small accumulated evidence of a life that had been made from two lives meeting at precisely the right hour, in precisely the right place, on a Kansas plain under an enormous western sky. 3 more years brought the particular deepening that good lives accumulate. Vernon's herd grew steadily, and he took on a second hand, a man named Caleb who had come west from Missouri and who learned quickly and worked without complaint. Gertrude's property expanded in a different direction. She began, carefully and with thorough research, growing a kitchen herb business, supplying dried herbs to the town restaurant that had opened in Caldwell in 1885, and to several of the homesteading families who had come to depend on her preserves and her advice about growing things in the Kansas climate. It was not a large income, but it was hers, generated from her own land and her own knowledge, and she kept careful accounts in a ledger she maintained in French. In the spring of 1887, their second child arrived. This one announced herself earlier than Marcel had, more decisive about timing, if somewhat more philosophical about volume. They named her Louise, after Gertrude's mother, who had died before Gertrude had left France and whose name Gertrude had carried as something precious. Louise arrived in April with dark hair and the gray-blue eyes that were unmistakably her mother's. And Marcel, aged nearly 3 and deeply opinionated about the new development, inspected her with great thoroughness and then declared her acceptable, which was, all things considered, the best possible reception. Marcel grew into a child who was bilingual in the unself-conscious way that children are when they learn 2 languages simultaneously from birth, French from his mother, and the songs she sang, and the stories she told, English from the world around him and from his father, who spoke both with equal comfort now, years deep into a French that had become part of him as genuinely as the land. Marcel moved between the languages without effort, as though they were simply 2 roads to the same place, which was, in fact, what they were. He would start school the following fall, where Pauline Graves, still Caldwell's schoolteacher, still single, still quietly pleased with herself for having lent a phrase book years ago, would teach him reading and arithmetic and American history, and he would be, as she would later tell Vernon with satisfaction, the best reader in his class by spring. Louise, watching everything from her place in the household with those thoughtful gray-blue eyes, was clearly going to have views of her own in due time. Gertrude wrote to Colette regularly, letters that were long and full, and that captured the life of the Kansas plains with the observational precision of a woman who had never stopped looking at her adopted home with fresh attention. She wrote about the cattle and the sky and the seasons and the quality of the light at different times of year. She wrote about Vernon, not gushingly, but with the solid certainty of love that has moved past needing to perform itself. She wrote about Marcel's laugh and Louise's expression of focused intent. She wrote about the creek in spring and the smell of new grass, and the way the summer thunderstorms moved across the prairie with the drama of something that knows it has an audience. Colette wrote back with equal regularity, and her letters were full of France, the markets of Lyon, the light on the river, the particular way October arrived in the city. And through these letters France remained present in Gertrude's life not as a source of longing, but as a beloved place from which she was also, in some real way, not entirely gone. Vernon read Colette's letters too now, without help. He read them at the table with his coffee while Gertrude fed Louise, and he would sometimes read a passage aloud in French that had made him smile, and Gertrude would say, "Oui, she always writes like that," with the fond exasperation that sisters reserve for sisters. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was cold, but mild compared to the winters they had already survived together, and they moved through it with the easy competence of people who know each other's rhythms, who know which tasks need doing without being asked, who can be in the same space working at different things and be entirely at ease in the parallel existence of it. Vernon had his lamp for reading, and she had her lamp for the accounts ledger, and there was the fire, and there were the children sleeping, and outside was the Kansas winter, enormous and indifferent, while inside the house was everything that mattered. On the first morning of spring of 1888, when the snow had receded enough for the first green to appear at the creek bank, and the red-winged blackbirds had returned to make their announcement from the cattails, Vernon went to the shed where he had been working in secret for the past several weeks and came out with a small wooden sign. He had carved it himself, working slowly and with patience, because woodworking was not his greatest skill, but it was something he had been practicing. He mounted it at the gate of the combined property, her 42 acres adjoining his 47, with the shared fence line that was no longer truly a boundary, and stepped back to look at it. The sign said, in letters he had carved carefully, Garrett, and beneath in smaller letters also carved, Chez nous, this is our home. Gertrude, who had come out to see what he was doing, stood beside him and looked at the sign. She was quiet for a moment. Marcel appeared at her side, took her hand, and looked at the sign with the concentrated expression of a child reading something important. Chez nous, he read aloud perfectly in his small, clear voice. Oui, Gertrude said. She took Vernon's hand on her other side. Yes. The spring light came across the plains in the particular way it does on the Kansas frontier, low and gold and very clear, without apology or ornament, simply what it is. The cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to leaf. The cattle were already restless in the south pasture, anticipating the season. Everything was beginning again, in the way that everything always begins again on the plains, where the sky is large enough to hold all of it, the seasons and the years, and the long story of people who came from somewhere else and built something here and called it home. Vernon Garrett stood at the gate of his life with his family beside him, under the enormous western sky, and felt the full weight and warmth of it. Every word he had learned, and every morning he had driven 6 miles in the cold, and every evening he had read by lamplight, and every conversation assembled across 2 languages and the distance between 2 entirely different worlds, felt it settle into something that was not complicated at all, in the end. She had arrived speaking only French, and he had spent all winter learning every word she knew, and in doing so had learned something larger than language, something that had no single word in either tongue, though both came close. Chez nous, home. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.